I may say that we've been criticised by the far right, not so much by researchers recently, but by politically motivated groups, the Taxpayers Alliance, for instance, who accuse us of picking and choosing data. We never pick and choose data. If a country isn't in one of these graphs, it's because the source of our data didn't have data for it. Even when we were very suspicious of a figure that the WHO or whoever give for a country, we include it. We feel that it would be quite wrong just to do any selection ourselves. I may say also, the other thing our critics do is suggest that we are the only people who've ever suggested that inequality is damaging. They ignore, we have about 400 references in the book to other work, but they talk as if ours was the only evidence, and so with our graph of violence, they say if you take a couple of countries off, there's not much of a relationship left. They ignore the fact there's the same relationship in our stuff on the US. And that there are about 50 studies now showing that violence is consistently more common in more unequal countries. There are also now about 200 studies of the relationship between greater inequality in a society and worse health. This is mental illness. The range, you see, this isn't people just coming to their GP, which might vary according to the healthcare system and so on, saying they're depressed and anxious. This is WHO, who used the same diagnostic interviews, so we could compare levels of mental illness in different countries, and it's the proportion of the population with any mental illness in the preceding year. And you see in the more equal countries it's as low as perhaps 8%. People have had some mental illness, and presumably most commonly anxiety and depression in the last year, but it rises to 3 times that in the most unequal countries. On several of these, when we first published, we had fewer observation points, but more of them have come in since then. WHO have published a few more, and they've come in very much where this relationship would predict. This is infant mortality. You can see that the regression line, it looks as if it should be steeper like that, shouldn't it? It's the sort of line of best fit that minimizes the distance between the line and the dots. But it's pulled down because of Singapore there. And that's an example. I did not believe that figure for Singapore should be taken at face value. It's the most unequal country claiming the lowest infant mortality. I've since been to Singapore and understand how they get a figure like that. But anyway, we don't pick and choose the data. This is drug abuse from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, use of opiates, cocaine, cannabis, ecstasy and amphetamines. We put them all together in one index, the separate figures on each of those drugs. When we have indexes, we don't put the figures up the side, because when you combine things, the units become what are called standard deviation units that most people wouldn't understand, so we just put high and low. And you can see a clear tendency for the more unequal countries to have higher rates of drug abuse. Teenage birth rates, difference is simply enormous. It's births per 1,000 women in their teens. And it goes from about 5 births per 1,000 up to, in the UK, 6 times as high. In the US, 10 times as high. Vast differences. This is violence. These are American states. This is somebody else's work. I told you there were about 50 papers looking at violence and inequality. So American states, but they've also, I think because they're Canadian, they added in the Canadian provinces, these little blue triangles down here. So Canadian provinces are more equal with lower homicide rates. And here you have absolutely vast differences. 15 homicides per million would be there, per million population, and it goes up to 150. A tenfold difference in rates of violence between more and less equal countries. Our graph isn't as dramatic as this, partly because we don't include the Canadian provinces, and they do say on our international one that pick a few countries off and there's not much left, but that just doesn't matter when there's so many other demonstrations of this relationship. This is imprisonment, the proportion of the population in prison. It's prisoners per 100,000 population. We've put this on a log scale, which means basically the difference from 1 to 10 is the same as from 10 to 100, and it has the effect of squashing the top. If something goes shooting up, it's a way of sort of bringing it, squashing it down. It would be a great curve going up otherwise. But it also makes it a bit harder to tell where the intermediate numbers are, but 40 might be about there, and it goes up to 400. So again, tenfold differences in rates of imprisonment in more or less equal countries. The differences we find in the American states are not quite as big. They're strongly related to inequality again. But one of the interesting things is that this is not driven primarily by more crime. In Britain, our prison populations peaked after crime had been declining for some years. And well, I'm not somebody who hits the radio or the television set when I'm listening to the news, but to hear our prison populations discussed so often on things like the Today programme, and never a single mention of inequality, but actually, if you know Britain's level of inequality, you could pretty accurately predict the level of imprisonment. But we also found some papers, research papers in the United States, trying to account for the rise in their prison populations. And they said that only about, I think 25% of it was more crime. Most of it was more punitive sentencing. And when we were writing our book, we found that there were just over 300 people with life imprisonment for shoplifting in California. Life for shoplifting, and in the States life tends to mean life, on the 3 strikes and you're out principle. But this is, I showed you trust is lower in more equal countries. I could have shown you measures of social capital, measures of social cohesion, involvement in community life. All that falls off with more inequality. I think you should think of this in the same, put it in the same basket as another element of what goes wrong with the quality of social relations. I don't know whether it's that there's more fear up and down the social hierarchy, or less empathy, or less trust, whatever it is. And it's also that the prisons, going to prison in those places is worse than going to prison in these. If you've got a choice where you go to prison, go in one of these countries. I may say, joke Kate makes, it's not really a joke, it's true. I suspect that this figure of Greece might not be so low, but two of their prisoners escaped. They did it by helicopter. The helicopter landed in the prison yard, they got in and it flew away. And it was a good news story because it was the second time they'd done it. They obviously had a pal with a helicopter. But just think of it as tenfold differences in the proportion of the population in prison, not primarily driven by more crime. And it's really appalling. I often think of health inequalities, that the social gradient in health as, if you like, the worst human rights abuse in the rich, developed market democracies. But this is pretty awful. This one is social mobility. It's another graph where actually we had rather few data points when we first wrote our book, but more have since come in and they fit very much on the same line. The measure of social mobility, it's income mobility. And what they're doing is comparing fathers' incomes when a child is born with the child's income 30 years later. And so these figures come from the big cohort studies where samples of the population have been followed through for at least 30 years. Random samples of the population. So what they're really asking is, do rich fathers have rich sons and poor fathers have poor sons? I'm afraid it's just about fathers and sons. Women don't count in this. I expect you're used to that. And what it shows is that in the more equal countries, there is higher mobility. Father's income makes less difference to son's income. And we thought that was intuitively plausible, the idea that if the social ladder is steeper, it's harder to climb, as it were, or the rungs are further apart, or there's more, I suspect, more downward prejudice, more class prejudice, more prejudice against ethnic minorities, and actually, I think, against women. But what it says is that it's unlikely that you'll get anywhere near equal opportunity with big inequalities of outcome. And I think that the idea of equal opportunities is constantly held out to draw attention away from the inequalities themselves by saying that it's somehow fair, we've all got a chance. And as you know, that belief is perhaps strongest in America. And Kate always adds that, if the Americans want to live the American dream, they should go to Denmark or Finland, where they've got a much better chance of becoming president or prime minister or whatever they have in Denmark and Finland. This is one of the things that puzzled me for longest, that inequality doesn't just affect the people at the bottom. It affects the tone of the social fabric throughout society and affects all of us. I've been pointing out the scale of the differences because in a way you can infer, and if you do a back-of-the-envelope calculation, you can see that you can't have these huge differences in outcome driven entirely by, I don't know, the poorest 10% or whatever. And, when we get asked about ethnic minorities or immigration, whether they're the cause, the same thing applies, whether they're 6% of the population or 10%. They're much too small to be driving this. But you don't just have to infer from considerations of that kind. We can sometimes compare inequalities, compare more and less equal countries all the way across the social hierarchy. And this is old data. When people first got interested in comparing health inequalities between nations, and some Swedish researchers classified a number of their deaths by the older Registrar General's occupational class classification. And so the blue lines are infant mortality in England and Wales, and the shorter red ones are Sweden. And here they are by occupational class. Class 1 is at the top. Occupations like doctors and lawyers and directors of larger companies. Goes down through to the junior manual, junior clerical people, and then skilled manual, semi-skilled and unskilled manual. It's again anachronistically a classification by father's occupation, so single parents go in their own group. But what you see is that Sweden does better right the way across. Even at the top of society, they're doing better. The differences are biggest at the bottom, but it looks as if everyone does better in Sweden. And there's another paper on adult mortality, which we show in our book, which gives just the same story. In fact, we have 5 or 6 graphs of this kind, comparing more or less equal states or more or less equal countries across the social scale. And this is just one other example. I won't show you all 6. It's a graph showing literacy scores of young people, 16 to 25 years old, in Sweden, Canada, US. It's again quite old data. They're classified by how many years of education their parents have had. So instead of classifying by social class in the last one, we're classifying by education of parents. So these are the offspring of well-educated parents nearer the top of society. And you see even there, it's a little bit better to be in Sweden than Canada, and worse to be in the most unequal country, the USA. But at the bottom of society, children of less well-educated parents, it makes a huge difference which you're in. This isn't one of the graphs in our book, we have a sort of more updated one. But you see, these are not telling us whether there are more poor people in more unequal societies. In fact, why our societies have become more unequal over the last few decades is that the rich have been running away from the rest of us. What it's saying, it's not telling us whether there are more or less poor people in each of these societies. It's telling you wherever you are, you do better if you are in a more equal society, whichever social class, whichever education group. So, you know, given your level of education, your income, whatever, your social class, you might live a wee bit longer in a more equal society. You'd be less likely to become a victim of violence. Your children would perhaps do a wee bit better at school. They'd be less likely to become involved in drugs or to become teenage parents. People have often misunderstood what we're saying. We're saying, given your level of income, where you are in society, that you do better in those kinds of terms if you lived in a more equal society. So back to this graph where we put everything together that I showed you earlier. I want to show it really to make 2 quick points. One is that in all the graphs I've shown you, and in many others in the book, I'm afraid the book has lots more, you will notice that it's always the same countries doing badly. You know, it's an embarrassing lecture to give in the USA. I'm quite glad sometimes to get to that child well-being graph where we can show Britain does worse on something, because it sounds as if we're being not crowing over them. And it's always the same countries that do well, usually the Nordic countries and Japan. And so what we're looking at is a sort of, it's not just 1 or 2 things going wrong with inequality, it's a sort of general social dysfunction. Most of those problems with social gradients get worse. And actually, to suggest it's causal, I mean, we do know the causal pathways for quite a number of these things and can make pretty good guesses at others, it's not a big causal jump, because all these things that we know are related to social status differences within our society, all we're saying is if you pull out those status differences or squash them up, the problems get worse. That inequality, as it were, amplifies the effects of social status. The other point I wanted to make is that people do sometimes say it's cultural differences, but and particularly they point to the English-speaking countries that do badly. In quite a few graphs it explains why some English-speaking countries do better or worse than others. But if you don't like the English-speaking countries, you can take them off. UK, New Zealand, Australia, USA, and you've still got a statistically significant relationship down here. But don't just think about those countries, not only because we show the data for the American states, but remember, there are hundreds of papers on inequality and health, looking at it amongst rich and poor countries, or in the regions of Russia, or the provinces of China, or in South American countries, whatever.